Greetings everybody. Yes, I've just had this through the post this morning, the Nikon Pro magazine. I just love it. You just can't beat the smell of printing ink. Gorgeous. Jesus, God, solvent abuse. Oh dear. Black and white picture on the front. The female gaze. Celebrating women in photography. Yes, why not? This photograph is of speed flying, a faster form of paragliding, off somewhere or other in the Bernese Alps. Yes, taken by Claudia Ziegler. Yes. Nice, action-packed black and white photograph. Lots of noise. ISO 200. Yeah, it's got to be a Nikon D5, hasn't it? But anyway. Oh dear, naughty boy. Right, now then, I did say in my last video that I was going to do a video on colour spaces, and guess what? Yes, I am. I'm going to do a video on colour spaces because, oh dear, so many people seem to misunderstand colour spaces. And right from the get-go, I'm going to say one thing. We've all got a digital camera, and you hear so many people on YouTube, really big photographers as well, saying, oh, well, I always set my camera to record in the Adobe RGB 1998 colour space because they go into their colour settings on their camera. And you've got a choice, as everybody has, doesn't matter what make of camera you've got, of recording in Adobe RGB 1998 or sRGB. But all these guys shoot RAW. And a RAW file isn't an image file, therefore you cannot tag it with a colour space. The Adobe RGB 1998 and sRGB colour space selections on your camera are solely there for if you want to record JPEG or TIFF. Not RAW. And yes, it is quite possible to have a JPEG in the Adobe RGB colour space and a TIFF in the sRGB colour space. Why you'd want to do that, I've no idea. But who shoots JPEG and who shoots TIFF? The majority of people who shoot JPEG because they have to. People who work for the big news agencies, they have to shoot JPEG. But anyway, that's beside the point. All I'm trying to get you to understand is you cannot tag a RAW file with a colour space. Therefore, setting your camera to Adobe RGB 1998 with regards to the RAW workflow has zero impact. And all these really big YouTube channels, I could say Fred and Wilmer, Tony and Chelsea Northrup, Throwboy, yeah, they all talk absolute crap about colour spaces because they haven't got a clue what they're talking about. But anyway, that's the big thing about your camera colour space, and we're going to look at camera colour spaces in a second. The one thing I would advise you to do though is always set your camera to not to sRGB, arc at me. Always set your camera to the Adobe RGB 1998 colour space, because that means that that's the colour space for your histograms. Yeah? And a histogram of an Adobe RGB 1998 setting is ever so slightly more expansive and ever so slightly more accurate with regards to exposure clipping. So always set your camera to Adobe RGB 1998, but it has no effect on your RAW files whatsoever. No, it doesn't. Okay, so talking of cameras and colour spaces, over here on the left hand side you can see I've got the Mac Colour Sync utility open here, and we've got a colour space open. Now what is this colour space? Yes, this is the colour space as calculated by phase 1 in not phase 1, but the people who now do capture 1, for the 5D Mark IV, Canon 5D Mark IV. There is the colour space for the 1DX Mark II, There, for example, is the colour space of a really common popular camera with everybody, the Sony A7R Mark III. Now then, over here on the right, we've got a two-dimensional representation of some colour spaces, because this, over here on the left, is a three-dimensional representation. So on this two-dimensional representation, we've got this lobate. There's a nice word, isn't it? Lobate. Well, we've got this lobate colour area, which is the CIE 1931 colour space, yes, which was calculated by a lot of research done by a couple of guys, and you can find that out over on Wikipedia. It was contrived by experiments done in the late 1920s by William David Wright using 10 observers. That was a really broad slice, wasn't it? And John Guild using a mere 7. So out of the entire population of the world, you chose 17 test subjects. Yeah, right, okay. Saying nothing. But anyway, so fundamentally we have 3 imaging colour spaces. sRGB, Adobe RGB 1998, which you might have heard me say in my previous video from last week should be scrapped. And we've also got Pro Photo. And yeah, it should be scrapped. It should be, because it's about as useful as a chocolate teapot. But, well, there you go. The fundamental thing is that this lobate form here is what they came up with as the maximum viewable colours perceived by the human eye. And then much later on, as imaging had to be standardised because of the likes of the birth of the internet, etc., and also desktop publishing, we had to somehow come up with industry standards for colour spaces. And as we all know, the bog standard colour space for the internet is sRGB, yeah? And then we have slightly bigger Adobe RGB, and let's go and have a look at these spaces in 3 dimensions. So there is the sRGB colour space, okay, and we'll just hold that for comparison, and then we'll go and have a look at the next biggest colour space, yes, which is the Adobe RGB 1998 one. It's probably best if we do those comparisons the other way around. And now you can see that, yes, fundamentally the Adobe RGB 1998 colour space, which is the white wireframe, is a lot bigger than the sRGB colour space. And over here we can see the sRGB colour space is this thin, fine black and white dotted triangle here. And then the Adobe RGB 1998 space is the dotted orange triangle. As you can see, they are. The Adobe one is much bigger. But how much is much? Now, you will come across quite a few people. I was watching one from an English guy who's got a very, very big YouTube channel. I'm not going to mention any names. But I came across this video because somebody sent a link to it and asked me if the guy was right or wrong. And fundamentally he's wrong, but Adobe actually use him for talks. Yes, they do. So he's quite prominent in the Adobe Photoshop demonstration in part of the industry and on YouTube. But he has this personal approach to using Adobe RGB 1998, which is so fundamentally flawed in this day and age. For the simple reason that, you know, I mean, if I hold the Adobe RGB 1998 space for comparison, and then I go and look at, say, the Sony A7R Mark III, you can see the A7R Mark III colour space, which is the native colour space of the sensor. It shows you all the colours, or represents the volume of the most saturated colours that can be captured by this sensor in the A7R Mark III by Sony. And of course we've got the Canon 5D Mark IV, which, you know, I mean, I really do rate the Canon 5D Mark IV, and anybody who sort of poo-poos it does so at their own risk. It's a truly cracking camera. But we have to capture our raw files and then bring them onto our computer, don't we? And the most common method of doing that is to import them into Lightroom. And this particular guy, who uses a Lightroom and Photoshop workflow, seems to think that he can have Lightroom running in Adobe RGB 1998. No, he can't. That's just crap. Bullshit. Absolutely. Lightroom has... It works on two colour spaces. It works on one in the background on your raw files, and one in what you call the front GUI, the graphic user interface that you use and you work with on your screen. And fundamentally, it's Pro Photo, and you can't change it. And you can say exactly the same for Adobe Camera Raw. They both work in Pro Photo Gamma 1 in the background and Melissa RGB in the front GUI. And I'll just go and show you those. We'll just clear out that comparison for a moment. There is the Pro Photo RGB colour space. And if we hold that for comparison, and then we go to the Melissa RGB colour space, which is the front GUI space for Lightroom, you can see there is no difference. Apart from the fact that the coordinate lines, because you have to remember these are three-dimensional shapes, and there are various colours inside this shape as well. And the coordinate lines, the block lines if you like, or delineation lines, are different. And that's because the two identical colour spaces have different gammas. Therefore, the same colour numbers can appear brighter or darker when you move between one space and the other. So, even though you're working in Melissa RGB in Lightroom, in the front GUI, all the adjustments to your image are taking place in Pro Photo RGB Gamma 1 in the background, because Gamma 1 is the native gamma of your camera. Yes, it is. And I do wish people would sort of either remember this or get to know it in the first place, or just not pass comment, because if you don't understand this stuff and you go talking on YouTube, YouTube is possibly one of the biggest methods of public information dissemination on the planet. And if you don't understand this stuff and you get it wrong, all you're doing is disseminating incorrect information. Right, so if we go and select the Pro Photo RGB colour space and hold this for comparison, and then compare that to the Sony A7 Mark III, now you can see that there are colours that are recordable by the sensor of the A7R Mark III that can't even be contained within the Pro Photo RGB colour space. So this is the sort of cycle that you have to be aware of in your colour management. And if I, what are we going to do now? If I go to the Adobe RGB colour space, and I hold that for comparison instead, and come and select the, I did that the wrong way round, there's the Sony, and we hold that for comparison and compare that to the Adobe RGB colour space, you can see that all the colours contained within that white wireframe are not in the Adobe RGB colour space, whereas 95% of them are in the Pro Photo RGB colour space. So This is the thing I'm trying to get at. I use a ProPhoto RGB workflow. And, of course, you bring your raw files into the likes of Lightroom, and you are viewing them in what is, to all intents and purposes, ProPhoto. It's Melissa, but, one is indistinguishable from the other. So you're viewing them in ProPhoto, even though you can't see it, because, of course, you are viewing it. Let's go and load up that Colour Monkey display. Not Colour Monkey display, that i12 display profile that I was talking about in the video last week. You can see that it is a lot larger than the Adobe RGB 1998 colour space. Therefore, you can see more of the colours captured by your camera than you would be able to if you got your monitor calibrated, or I got this monitor calibrated to the Adobe RGB 1998 colour space. I can see more of the colours captured by the camera. Now, there used to be this old school of thought that if I can't see it, I can't colour manage it, which on the face of it is somewhat true. But colours don't behave in random ways. So the colours that you can see, if you can set those the way you want them, the colours that you can't see accurately displayed on your monitor, they will follow along. You're not going to get sort of, say, this blue here, which is capturable by the camera, but not displayable on the monitor using this monitor profile. It's not going to suddenly turn bloody pink because you do something, because its nearest neighbour that you can see, that will be the one you're working to. So if its nearest neighbour looks alright, then the colours that are outside your sphere of view will still be okay. Now, the reason I use the ProPhoto RGB colour space is, yes, in an archival image, it archives more of the colours captured by your camera, whether you can see them or not. But you are actually future-proofing the camera-captured colours, because the only ways that we can improve photography in the future is by increasing the potential colour gamut display of a monitor, and more importantly, increasing the colour gamut or colour space of printers. I do not know what that little noise was. That was either my son or my wife walking past and making funny noises. But anyway, what I was saying was, we need to future-proof our images. And if we don't future-proof them, if we got a raw file, we got a particular image we captured and we worked it up and we archived it out in Adobe RGB, and then 10 years from now, we find out that the latest printer that we bought can actually print out 35% more colour than it can print now, chances are those colours won't be in your original image processing. So what you've got to do is go back and re-edit it. Yeah? Why on earth would you want to do that when all you need to do is save out your archived image either in Lightroom or in Photoshop, just tag it with the ProPhoto RGB colour space in the first place, because then it will contain more colour than you can really use at the moment. But if you suddenly get a massive increase in the amount of colour that you can produce with a printer, then all you've got to do is re-soft-proof the image. It's crackers. Why anybody would want to work in an Adobe RGB 1998 workflow here in 2019 is totally bloody beyond me. It's ridiculous. It's like living in a trench. You're living in a hole. You're living in the past. Yeah, I mean, years and years ago, digital cameras could barely struggle to record anything close to Adobe RGB 1998. That's when digital cameras first came out. But it didn't take them long before they were recording and capturing colours outside of the Adobe RGB 1998 colour space. So, to my way of thinking, the Adobe 1998 colour space has been outdated for a considerable length of time. So, all I'm trying to get you to understand is how colour spaces fit together. And so, if we clear this comparison now, and so we've got the sRGB colour space, which we know is the smallest one, but we've always got to utilise the sRGB colour space for when we put our pictures on the internet. As a stock photographer, we need to send our images to our stock agencies in the sRGB colour space. So it's a very, very, very important colour space for a working photographer. But really and truly, Adobe RGB 1998 as an archival image colour space is outdated because it is just not big enough. When we compare that again, we'll go and compare that to the 5D Mark IV. The 5D Mark IV colour space just drowns it. The 5D Mark IV is capable of capturing colours that are way outside the Adobe RGB 1998 colour space. But of course, if I hold that for comparison now, and I go and compare it to the ProPhoto RGB colour space, now you can see there's colours capturable in this white wireframe here, which are even outside the ProPhoto RGB colour space. Yes. So, do we want our cameras to be able to capture more colour? Not really, because they capture more colour now than we are capable of reproducing. And I very much doubt if it'll ever get to the point where we can display on a monitor and print on a printer all the colours that are captured by today's cameras, let alone the cameras that are available to us in the future. Now, I hope that's given you an understanding of camera colour spaces and how they relate to archival image standard colour spaces, sRGB, Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB. And I hope now you understand the importance, to my way of thinking, of the ProPhoto RGB colour space, because it maintains the largest gamut of colour captured by your camera in the raw format, and it future-proofs your images. Now, the thing is that here we are, we're looking at the ProPhoto RGB colour space. Now, if I hold that for comparison and then compare that to, let's say, the colour space for Permajet fibre-based distinction paper on an Epson SCP-800 printer, which I don't own because it's too expensive for me to buy, but well, there you go. So, if we archive our raw files as 16-bit TIFFs in the ProPhoto RGB colour space, and then we want to do a print, you can see that there's a potential. Always bear in mind that all these colours that you see in these colour spaces don't all exist in the same photograph. They couldn't do. You'd have to be on a bloody real-life acid trip for them all to be present in the same photo. But the colours that are in your image that lie outside of the actual colour space of the printer, paper, ink combination that you're using, they can be brought into Gamut through soft proofing, which is what I demonstrated in a previous video a few weeks back. That is the whole purpose of soft proofing. In other words, shoehorning big colour spaces into smaller colour spaces. Now, the fundamental thing is this. if you were to change, even by today's standards, if you were to change from a Epson SCP 800 printer to an Epson SCP 9000 printer using exactly the same paper, you'll see that the actual printer colour space on the same paper is larger. Let's do it again. There's the SCP 800 colour space for fibre-based distinction by Permajet, and there is the SCP 9000 colour space for Permajet fibre-based distinction. So the colour space of a printer paper ink combo will vary just fundamentally because of A, the ink, or B, the size of the print head, the accuracy of the print head, the number of dots per inch that you're printing at, which has got absolutely bugger all to do with the pixel per inch resolution of your shot, as Mr. Tony Northrop quite obviously doesn't bloody understand, going on the video that he put up the other day. What a lunatic, the absolute idiot. But well, there you go. That's just another story, which I'm not going to get into. But he's completely and utterly wrong. Now, you must just understand that every device that you use has its own colour space. It doesn't matter whether we are talking about your Sony A7R Mark III, your, where are we? Where's it gone? Can't see, not got my glasses on. Your Canon 5D Mark IV, your Canon 1DX Mark II, or whatever camera. They all have, when you're shooting RAW, their own native sensor colour spaces. We then want to preserve, for archival purposes and future-proofing, as much of that captured colour as is humanly possible. The only way we can do that is by archiving those images out as 16-bit TIFFs or 16-bit PSDs, if you like, or PSBs, Photoshop big files if your work has got a lot of layers in the image, and archiving them out in the Pro Photo RGB colour space, because that's the only way you're going to retain as much of the original camera captured colour as you can do. And then soft proofing will allow you to bring that, or bring those Pro Photo RGB colours which are contained within your one particular image. Soft proofing will then enable you to fit those colours into your chosen paper ink printer combo. And as I said in a video a few weeks back that I did on soft proofing, if you're having trouble trying to fit an image onto a particular paper, try some of the other colour spaces, which that's what an ICC profile is. It's nothing more than a colour space. Try another colour space, because you'll find one that's bigger. Yes, you will. And therefore you will be able to soft proof your Pro Photo RGB image into that colour space for that printer and get a print off your printer that looks just like your image on the screen, and you'll be able to do that a lot easier. Because sometimes you get the impression that trying to fit an image onto a piece of printing paper, it's like trying to fit a battleship into a shoebox. Yeah, and that's because your chosen paper profile or paper colour space is too small. So there you go. Just as a little bit of a demo, I'll take this balloon here. Cool, that took a bit of doing. Need to give up smoking. So if we said we've got black here and we've got white at the end. Have I got a W on the end? Yes, I have. And we've got red, we've got blue, and we've got green. Those are three fully saturated primary colours, red, green and blue. And to be quite honest with you, it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about the sRGB colour space, which is that, or the Adobe RGB colour space, which is like that, or we are talking about the Pro Photo RGB colour space. And if you think I'm going any further, you've got another thing coming. Yeah? But it's much bigger again. But the actual nature of the primary red, primary green, and primary blue colours, plus white, plus black, don't change. They are the same colours. They look visually exactly the blooming same, no matter whether you're in sRGB, Adobe RGB, or Pro Photo RGB. But because we are now in Pro Photo RGB and we're in a much, much bigger colour space, we've got a bigger distance through this balloon from black to white. Black's the same, white's the same, but if we've got a bigger distance, that means we've got more individual grey tones. Okay, so we've got much greater tonal separation between black and white, and the same thing can be said for our primary colours. We've got a much larger separation between red and green, so we've got a greater range of individual hues to get us from primary red to primary green, from primary green through to primary blue. Yeah, so the larger the colour space, the greater is your colour variation. I've been dying to do this for ages. Yeah, so I'm going to say it now. But without colour management, woohoo! Yeah, there you go. I didn't expect it to land there. I've been dying to do that for ages. But I hope you get the point. We don't get different colours suddenly appearing in Pro Photo. We don't. We've got the same primary colours, red, green and blue. What we have is greater colour variation to get from one to the other. And we have greater gradational grey tones to get from black to white. And don't forget, all these colour spaces are to do with digitised images. Yeah? If we go out into the big wide world, we're in an analogue world. It's lit by analogue light coming from that great big ball of fire in the sky. That's if you can see it, because there's no clouds. But that ain't digital. No, that doesn't come in little blocks. That is infinitely variable between black and white, red and green, green and blue, blue back to red again. There is an infinite number of colours that are out there in the natural world, and our cameras do a very, very good job of capturing those colours, even though they have to separate them out and make them into little tiny blocks. But the massive size of your camera's raw capture colour space allows us to get a very, very fine differentiation between those colours and those little coloured blocks. So everything appears to be seamless. When you go and put things into a smaller colour space, you're not changing the nature of black or white or primary red or primary green or primary blue. You're pushing them together, which reduces the number of colour graduation steps between them, and also reduces the number of grey, separate grey steps between black and white. So I hope you found that interesting. And just to sort of get me over the shock, I'm going to do a little bit of solvent abuse. Aren't I a bad lad? Okay, guys, I hope that's explained colour spaces to you. I hope you've got a slightly better understanding of what's going on in this wonderful world of colour management with simple, basic fundamentals of colour spaces. So until the next time, guys, stay safe, stay well, keep taking the pictures, which I ought to go out and take some pictures because I've not been doing much of late, but well, there you go. And I shall see you, boys and girls, very soon in the next one. So until then, tooroo.